I had left. I came back. My life improved. Case closed. Jesus was real. Well, at least that's what I thought. And then my father died. I did not become a Christian because I investigated Christianity and I decided it was true. Man, I was 7 years old and I was told there was a heaven and I was told there was a hell. And I was told Jesus was coming back in something called a rapture. And I was told that if I was bad, I was going to go to hell. Think about that for a second. I was 7. I remember having nightmares, Satan, depictions, fire, scary things. Things I didn't completely understand, but I understood enough to be afraid, And the strange part is that even at that age, I do not remember actually believing all of this because I had evidence for it. I accepted it because of my parents. The adults around me told me it was reality. There was no investigation. There was no choice between competing ideas, There was no question of evidence. This was just how the universe worked. God was real. Jesus was real. Satan was real. Demons was real. Heaven was real. And I had better behave accordingly or I was going to hell. Looking back at that now, I think some of my behavior as a child actually came from that fear. I would lash out. I go get in trouble on purpose. And then I turn around and I'll say, oh, well, Jesus would forgive me. He'll forgive me 77 times. Because that's what I had been taught. I was a child trying to understand a reality that adults had already defined for me. And that is why today I want to talk about something extremely personal. The anatomy of indoctrination. Not just how I became a Christian, but how Christianity shaped the reality I was living in before I was even old enough to ask whether if any of it was actually true. What's going on, everybody? I'm the Jewish Skeptic. And before we get too far into this, I need to explain something. When I say indoctrination, y'all, I'm not saying my parents were evil. I'm not saying everybody in my childhood church was intentionally trying to manipulate me. Most of those people believe what they were teaching. My parents believed it. The people at the church believed it. They thought they were preparing me for life. They thought they were protecting my soul, But that is actually what makes indoctrination so powerful. It doesn't always look like somebody forcing a lie on you. Sometimes everybody involved sincerely believes they are giving you the truth. And when you're a child, you don't have the tools to separate what somebody believes from what somebody can actually demonstrate. So you accept their reality as your reality. This is what happened to me. I was exposed to Christianity around 7 years old. And some of my earliest memories of Christianity are connected to fear, actually. The rapture, hell, heaven, Jesus coming back, being punished for doing wrong, being told what could happen to me if I didn't follow Jesus, Those things might sound normal to somebody that grew up in the church. They were normal to me too. But that is the point. When everybody around you treats something as normal, you rarely stop to ask whether it should be normal. I remember having bad dreams about fiery things. I remember being afraid. And I did not really know how to process that fear, y'all. Sometimes I'd act out. Sometimes I'd get in trouble. And Christianity even became part of how I understood getting in trouble. I was taught Jesus forgives. So little CJ would basically think like this. All right, I messed up. Jesus will forgive me again 77 times and I'm good. That was my understanding of the world. And some of my church memories were not so good memories. I remember Easter speeches, Christmas speeches, standing in front of everybody at church, memorizing scripts. And for me, that could be terrorizing, because if I could not remember that script perfectly, that could possibly be punishment waiting for me. So now I'm standing in front of a church. I'm uncomfortable. I'm afraid of forgetting my lines. I'm afraid of what happens if I mess up. And I'm performing beliefs that I don't even think I believe myself. That part is important, because I do not remember some moment as a child where I thought, yes, I've examined Christianity and I believe that it is true. No, that's not how it worked. I accepted Christianity because Christianity had been presented to me as reality. That is a massive difference. See, nobody sat the 7-year-old me down and said, CJ, here are the major religions of the world, you know? Here's Christianity. Here's Islam. Here's Judaism. Here are the Hindu traditions. You know, even as atheists, because I knew what an atheist was, you know, here are the people who don't believe in gods. They gave me the Bible. Here's the evidence everyone presents. Now examine all of it and make your decision. Come on, man. I was 7. I was being told the answer before I even understood the question. And when the people giving you the answer are your parents and other adults that you trust, why would you assume that they're wrong? That is the reality children live in. You trust the people raising you, and eventually what they believe can become what you believe, not because you have independently discovered it, but it's just simply because it was there first. Then when I was about 12 years old, I got baptized. And this is another part of the story that looks completely different to me now, y'all, because I didn't want to get baptized. I did it for my parents. I wanted to keep them happy. I knew baptism was something they wanted for me. And when you are 12 years old, keeping your parents happy matters, you know? So I did it. From the outside, I'm sure it looked like I had accepted Jesus. It looked like I had made this big personal decision, you know. Everybody could celebrate. Everyone could say I gave my life to Christ. But inside, that was not really what was happening. I still had doubts. I still didn't really understand why I was supposed to believe all of this. I was participating because it was expected of me. That is something I think we need to be careful about when we talk about children making religious commitments, y'all. From the outside, it could look like conviction. It could look like faith. It could look like a child made some deep spiritual decisions. But sometimes the child just wants their parents to be proud of them. And that was me. I was baptized at 12, not because I had investigated Christianity and not because I had examined the evidence and I decided Jesus was God. I did it because I love my parents and I wanted to keep them happy. And afterward, my baptism became another thing that could be pointed to as proof that I had chosen Christianity. But had I really chosen it? Or was I still following the reality that had been built around me since I was 7? That question hits very hard and differently now. And then as I become a young adolescent, something started happening. I rebelled, y'all. I stopped wanting to go to church. I had doubts. Something about it just wasn't connecting with me. And now there's an interesting contradiction. I had already been baptized, and according to everybody around me, I had accepted Jesus. But internally, I was still questioning all of it. I started pulling away from church, and repeatedly my parents would tell me I was headed toward destruction. I needed to accept Jesus. I needed to get right. I needed to come back, I need to start back going to church. But think about what that does when those ideas have already been planted in you as a child. Even when you rebel against the religion, you are still rebelling inside the world the religion created. You can stop going to church and still be afraid of hell. You can doubt Jesus and still wonder if Jesus is angry with you. You can reject the sermon and still have the rapture sitting somewhere in the back of your mind, The belief system does not necessarily disappear just because you stop participating in it. That fear can stay with you. And some of it stayed with me. Eventually, I got older, and I started my own life. And life was difficult. I struggled at first. There were periods where I just was trying to survive, And those old religious ideas were still here. I would have bad dreams and I would swear I saw demonic entities. I believe there was spiritual forces holding me back, in my dreams and stuff, holding me. I interpreted what was happening through the worldview I had been given as a child. And this is something I understand much differently today. When Christianity is already the lens through which you understand reality, your experiences start getting interpreted through Christianity, folks. I'll give you an example. You have a bad dream. Oh, it's a demonic attack. Something goes wrong. Oh, it's spiritual warfare. Something goes right, on the other hand, is God opened the door. And you're not necessarily pretending. You genuinely experience the world that way. And eventually, I welcomed Christianity back into my life. My wife was already Christian, so Christianity coming into our household was not really that difficult. It made sense. It felt familiar. It felt like coming back to something I already knew, And eventually, we became members of the Potter's House in Dallas, Texas, when we lived in Dallas. And then something happened that made my belief even stronger. My life started changing. And it started changing for the better. I started becoming financially stable. Real financially stable, too. I became independent. Things I had struggled with began changing. And what conclusion do you think I reached? Christianity was true. Look at my life. I came back to God and things got better. At the time, that felt like evidence. I didn't call it confirmation bias. I didn't ask what other explanations might exist. I didn't ask whether people from other religions also became successful after recommitting themselves to their faith. I saw exactly what my worldview had taught me to see, y'all. God was blessing me, and every improvement became another piece of evidence. I had left, I came back, my life improved, case closed. Jesus was real. Well, at least that's what I thought. And then my father died. My father committed suicide, y'all. And that changed something inside of me, because I knew how deeply my father believed. I watched that man worship Jesus. You hear me? I knew how seriously he took his faith. And now I had questions I could no longer push to the side. Why would Jesus allow this? If Jesus was really there in the way we had been taught he was there, then where was he when my father needed him? Why did this happen to someone so deeply embedded in his belief? I wasn't sitting there trying to become an atheist. That was nowhere on my mind. I wanted answers, and I wanted Christianity to make sense. I wanted to understand what happened. But for probably the first time in my life, I was no longer satisfied with just being given another religious answer. God has a plan. Everything happens for a reason. We can't understand God's ways. Those answers were no longer enough for me, and I wanted to know. After my father died, I also became interested in where my family came from. I wanted to understand my history. So I took a DNA test through myheritage.com. That opened the door to a much deeper family history research. And through that research, I came across ancestral connections that pointed me towards Judaism, going far back into my family history. That fascinated me because, remember, I grew up a Christian. I knew God. I knew Jesus. At least I thought I did. But certainly I wanted to understand Judaism. I wanted to understand the religion Christianity came out of. I wanted to understand the history behind all of this. And that curiosity completely changed the direction of my life. Oh boy, did it really. I started studying theology, religious history, ancient religions, and I was not doing it because I hated Christianity. I was fascinated, and honestly, I still am. Religion is interesting. Human beings have been trying to understand existence for thousands of years. And the deeper I went, the more I started noticing something. Christianity was not standing alone. Ancient cultures had creation stories, flood stories, gods, spirits, divine beings, sacred rituals, ideas about death, ideas about the afterlife, miracles, prophecy, good and evil. Christianity suddenly looked less like this completely isolated thing dropped from heaven and more like another religion that developed inside of human history to me. That did not immediately make me an atheist, though, but it created another question. And the question was this: if I dismiss everybody else's supernatural claims, then why am I giving mine special treatment? That question bothered me. And I kept going. I started looking into philosophy, anthropology, history, physics, anything that could help me understand how we actually build knowledge. And slowly my question changed. I stopped asking, can I find a way to defend Christianity? And I started asking, can I demonstrate that Christianity is true? Those are two very different questions. And eventually I had to admit something to myself. I could not demonstrate my God any better than anyone else could demonstrate theirs. And that was difficult because this was not just an argument on the internet for me. This was my life, my childhood, my family, my marriage, my experiences, my success, my father's death. My entire understanding of reality was connected to this, people. And now I was questioning the foundation. Then religious history slide in and hits me with something else that sounds almost ridiculous when I say it now that I know. I had served God for years and I didn't even know his name. Seriously, God was just God to me. That was his name as far as I understood it. Nobody had walked me through Yahweh, the history of ancient Israel, how Israelite religion developed, how ideas about Yahweh changed over time, how ancient Israelites existed inside the same ancient Near Eastern world as everybody around them. I had spent years believing I understood God without understanding the history of the God I was worshiping. That realization was huge for me, folks, because now I was no longer just asking theological questions. I was asking historical questions. Where did these ideas come from? When did they develop? What did the earliest Israelites actually believe? How did Judaism develop? How did Christianity develop from Judaism? Once I started asking those questions, the Bible began looking real different to me. And I was no longer only reading scripture as revelation. I was reading it as ancient literature for what it really is, written by human beings in cultures, in political situations, in particular moments in history. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. And then I almost walked into another belief system, y'all, the Black Hebrew Israelite movement. When I first discovered Black Hebrew Israelite teachers, they actually grabbed my attention. Think about where I was mentally at that time. I had discovered information about my ancestry. I was learning about Judaism. I was questioning Christianity. And here comes a group telling me they have the real story. They know who the real Israelites are. They know what history has supposedly hidden from us. They have the truth everybody else missed. And I wanted to believe it. I actually considered joining them because at the time I didn't know enough. And this is where indoctrination becomes bigger than Christianity for me. I had started escaping one system and almost walked directly into another one. Same confidence, different claims. Same feeling that someone has finally revealed the hidden truth. But this time I kept studying. I checked the history. I looked at the anthropology. I compared the claims, and it fell completely apart. I realized I was doing it again, though. I was attracted to an answer before I had established that the answer was true. That was probably one of the biggest lessons in my entire journey. Leaving one religion does not automatically make you a skeptic. You can leave one certainty and immediately replace it with another. That is when skepticism became much more important to me. Not atheism, skepticism. It's in the name. Because skepticism gave me something religion had never really given me. Permission not to have the answer. I could say I don't know. I can investigate something without already knowing what conclusion I needed to reach. I could change my mind. I could ask for evidence. I could admit when the evidence was not enough. I could apply that standard to everybody. Christians, Muslims, Jews, Black Hebrew Israelites, atheists, and myself. Especially myself. That was freedom for me. And this is where I finally understood what had happened. At 7 years old, Christianity did not convince me that it was true. Christianity defined what truth looked like before I knew how to investigate truth. That is a very different thing. Hell existed before I could question hell. Demons existed before I understood psychology. The rapture existed before I knew anything about biblical history. Jesus was God before I knew anything about the development of Christianity. The Bible was the word of God before I knew who wrote these texts or how they even developed. And even my baptism happened before I had really examined any of it. At 12 years old, other people could look at me getting baptized and say, well, there it is. He chose Jesus. But inside, I knew I had done it because I wanted to make my parents happy. I was given the conclusion first. Then I spent years interpreting my experiences through that conclusion. That is what I mean by when I say reality or my reality was programmed. Not that somebody turned me into a robot. Not that I never thought for myself. But the framework was already there. So when I had nightmares, I saw demons. When I struggled, I saw spiritual warfare. When I succeeded, I saw God's blessings. When tragedy happened, I searched for God's purpose. Christianity had already given me the categories. I was just fitting my life into them. And before somebody twists this episode into something I did not say, let me make this very clear. My story does not prove Christianity is false. That is not how this works. Showing that somebody was indoctrinated does not automatically disprove what they were taught. A belief can be taught badly and still be true. That is why evidence still matters. My point is different. If you inherited your belief before you were capable of examining it, then at some point you owe it to yourself to go back and examine the foundation. Not because Christianity must be false, but because something being familiar does not make it true. Something making you feel good does not make it true. Something helping you through life does not make it true. Something being taught by your parents does not make it true. And something being written in an ancient book does not automatically make it true. The question remains the same. How do we know? Eventually, I deconstructed. And today, I describe myself as a Jewish atheist. Jewish because of my ancestry and the history I discovered while trying to understand where I came from. Atheist because I no longer believe in the gods I once believed were obviously real. But skepticism is probably the most important part of this entire journey. Because I do not want another system telling me what I gotta believe. I want to know what the evidence actually supports. And if the answer is I do not know, then I'm comfortable saying I do not know. That took me years to learn. So, was I indoctrinated? Yes, I believe so. But not because everybody around me was evil, not because they were part of some grand conspiracy to control me, you know. Most of the people teaching me Christianity were themselves taught Christianity by somebody they trusted. And those people were taught by somebody else. That is how worldviews can move from one generation to another without anyone stopping to ask where the original claim came from. And that brings me back to the 7-year-old me. A little kid having nightmares about fire, afraid of hell, afraid of the rapture, standing in church, trying to remember an Easter speech or a Christmas speech perfectly. Being told Jesus was watching, being told heaven was real, being told hell was real. Then at 12 years old, getting baptized, even though I really didn't want to. Not because I had examined Christianity, not because I had reached some deep spiritual conclusion, but because I wanted to keep my parents happy. That kid never chose Christianity after examining the evidence. He inherited it. And for years, I confused participation with belief, baptism with conviction, fear with spiritual awareness, success with God's blessing, nightmares with demons, and being familiar with truth. It took the adult version of me decades to finally go back and ask whether the foundation underneath everything I believe could actually hold up. And once I started asking that question, I couldn't stop. So if you grew up religious, I want you to ask yourself something. Not whether your religion feels true, not whether your parents believed it, not whether your pastor believed it, not whether you had experience, you interpreted through it. Ask yourself this. If nobody had told you what to believe when you were a child, would the evidence available to you today lead you back to that exact same belief system? And if the answer is yes, show your work. Because that is where the real conversation begins. I am the Jewish skeptic. Question everything, especially the reality you inherited. And remember, no fear, no dogma, just clarity. I'll see you guys on the next one.
Do you know what I found? The more you know, the less you know.